Welcome back to Dentro La Storia. Today we have a slightly different instant video because in a few days, we Italian citizens will be called to vote. We're not voting for an election, it's a referendum, but it's not a referendum like the others. How many types of referendums are there in Italy? 3. There is the abrogative referendum, which means that citizens have the possibility to intervene by removing laws from our legal system simply by saying they don't want them anymore. Then there's the consultative referendum, which isn't binding because basically the consultative referendum is just a way to gauge public opinion, to see what people think. It's something that could easily be done through an opinion poll, but in some cases it's decided to go ahead with a referendum result anyway. But if the consultative referendum basically has almost zero value, and if the abrogative referendum has limitations, why is a quorum required? To be valid, at least 50% plus one of the active voting population must go to vote. And moreover, it cannot concern topics like budget laws, pardons, amnesties, or the ratification of international treaties. The last referendum, the last type of referendum, the one we are going to examine, the one we are going to vote on, the one we will go to the polls for in a few days, is an extremely particular type. It is a constitutional referendum, a confirmatory referendum. What does that mean? To understand this, we need to look inside the Constitution, specifically its second to last article, Article 138, which describes the procedures for amending the Constitution itself. It should be noted that the last article, Article 139, categorically excludes the possibility that the Republican form can be subject to constitutional revision. For the rest, Article 138 states that the reform of the Constitution must follow a strict and precise procedure. With a double reading in both houses, the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, of the draft law. In the first reading in both houses, a simple majority is required for approval. In the second reading, after a certain number of months, a qualified 2/3 majority is required. Why is that? To prevent a simple parliamentary majority, which might represent a minority of the country, from drastically changing the Constitution. It's a safety mechanism. So what happens if a constitutional bill passes without issues in the first reading in both houses, but in the second reading, it doesn't get the qualified majority in one or both houses? That's when the confirmatory constitutional referendum comes into play. A referendum for which no quorum is required. So even in the absurd scenario where only one citizen went to the polls to vote, that referendum would still be valid. Of course, it will never happen, and I hope it never happens, that only one citizen goes to the polls to vote. That would be the death of our democracy. But that's what is provided for. It's possible. You can intervene in this way. And in this case, voting yes means wanting to approve the bill already ratified by Parliament. Voting no means opposing and completely rejecting that constitutional reform. In the history of our country, we have already had 4 constitutional referendums. 2 that led to the approval of the changes and 2 that instead rejected them. The first time people went to vote was on October 7, 2001, for the reform of Title V of the Constitution, the relationship between the state and the regions. With an extremely low turnout, 34% at a time when voter turnout for political elections was still decent. We were around 65 to 70%. On that occasion, 64.2% of the voters who went to the polls approved the reform. The next referendum was held on June 25th and 26th, 2006. The so-called devolution, that is, the attempt to devolve to local authorities, mainly the regions, some powers of a state nature. It was a constitutional reform wanted by the third Berlusconi government, and it was rejected. The turnout was higher than the previous confirmatory referendum. It was 53.6%, and the no vote reached 61%. This was also a historic occasion, not only because it marked the end of the Federalist project through the instrument of devolution, but also because the citizens gave a clear answer. Third episode, December 4th, 2016. The constitutional reform called Renzi-Boshi, that is, the overcoming of perfect bicameralism plus further changes, turn out even higher than the previous one. 69%, so it was a very strongly felt issue. And no prevailed again this time with 59.11%. Among other things, the referendum had a political impact because it led to Matteo Renzi's resignation as head of the government, so the end of his period as head of the government, and later the formation of the Gentiloni government. That referendum had been extremely personalized because Matteo Renzi himself had almost made it a personal challenge. Either I win or I go home. He went home, we all know that. The most recent referendum was in September 2020, the constitutional reform to reduce the number of members of parliament, to go from almost 1,000 parliamentarians, including deputies and senators, to 600. It was presented as a necessity for saving money, for spending review. Actually, I still believe that it was a foolish decision because fewer parliamentarians means fewer representatives, which means less opportunity for the average citizen to have their voice heard in Parliament and therefore in national politics. That reform was approved with 69.6% of favorable responses. The result was therefore a reduction in the number of parliamentarians who, starting from the elections in September 2022, were first reduced in the constituencies and then, of course, in the seats. Now we are going to vote on the Justice Reform Project and the reorganization of the judiciary. On one hand, the definitive separation of the careers between investigating judges and judging judges, and on the other hand, the splitting up of the Superior Council of the Judiciary, the Superior Council of the Judiciary, by creating more oversight bodies. It is a reform that was wanted by the current government and is signed by Minister Carlo Nordio, the Minister of Justice. It is a highly contested reform because, on one hand, it focuses precisely on the issue of definitively separating the careers of magistrates, to give absolute guarantees to the defendant in criminal proceedings, because we're only talking about criminal proceedings here, not civil cases, of transparency and assurance against interference. On the other hand, the government's intention to try to subdue the judiciary is being criticized, which, according to our Constitution, based on Montesquieu's principles, is separate from the other branches of power. That is, the legislative branch, which makes the laws, and the executive branch, which enforces the laws. In recent days and weeks, you must have heard both sides, those in favor of yes and those in favor of no. It's clear that this reform project, this reform bill, has already passed in Parliament. But in order to be final, in order to actually take effect, it must go through the scrutiny of the people's will. It's something shocking compared to what was decided by the Founding Fathers. Let us always remember one principle. Changes to the Constitution should be changes to improve the Constitution itself, or to make it suitable for the needs of immediacy, daily life, and the evolution of the times. But is it really always like that? Or sometimes is the will to make reforms just to please someone, a political side or something else, or to distract public opinion, or simply to try to destroy what was there before? The Constitution was not born in a day. The Constitution was born after 18 months of intense work carried out by experts, the Founding Fathers, coming from many different schools, from many different ways of thinking, from many different parties, and who were able to work together in a concerted way, working all together, overcoming mistrust, sometimes even overcoming what could have been an obstacle, to find something in common, something that would do good for a country that at the time was emerging from a destructive war. It had a great desire to start over. Changing what was written by the Founding Fathers should be done very carefully, and if the tool of the constitutional confirmatory referendum is used, it means that something didn't work in Parliament. Because think about it for a moment. At the time of the Constituent Assembly, as I told you, the Founding Fathers came from many different parties. They didn't always get along with each other. In fact, sometimes they argued. But if they managed to produce this text of 139 articles perfectly balanced, making possible the birth of a new state, a new form of state, able to offer broad guarantees and protections to everyone. So it means that the tensions, the mistrust, the jealousies were set aside, and this is commendable. But what if in Parliament, in our Parliament, the parties can't find a common ground and constitutional reforms are pushed through by a majority, a party majority, as a government coalition, without seeking dialogue with the other political forces, saying, fine, but if anything, there will be a referendum, and we'll see. It means that there isn't a real will to change for the better. There's only the will to impose something that someone likes, but not everyone. And it's not certain that this something will do good for the republic itself and for the citizens who make up this republic. I always like to remember a phrase from the late lawyer Giorgio Ambrosoli, who, among other things, was of monarchist faith. So it's not like he loved the republic in such a deep way, but he was an upright, just, intelligent, and sensitive person. Lawyer Ambrosoli said, "We are the state. We citizens make it. With our work, with our identity, we must always remember this. It's not something to take for granted. It's not something to forget." So let's remember this even when we go to vote in the constitutional referendums. If someone in Parliament tried to force things and impose a reform without talking with the other political forces, simply relying on numbers, on the majority, and maybe on a couple of useful alliances, then maybe that reform shouldn't be seen as something exactly positive for the nation. Maybe it's just something that was designed to benefit some and to the detriment of others. Someone might say to me, we still need a separation of careers? We still need the will to make the criminal trial more transparent? Let me give you two pieces of news. The first, years ago, the Cartabia reform was introduced, which, despite all its problems, established the principle of separation of careers. With the Cartabia reform, a magistrate can only switch from the investigative role to the judging role once. Moving back and forth between the two offices is not allowed, only once. After that, you must pick a side, which in itself is transparency. The real problem in the Italian justice system is not criminal justice, which, yes, is not very fast, but maybe it would be faster if Parliament would stop passing laws that hinder criminal prosecution every time. The real problem in Italy is civil litigation. Civil trials last 7-8 years, if not more. Let's not even talk about administrative justice. Those are the real problems. Problems that, curiously, our politicians don't want to solve. Why? Ask yourselves, for what reason? And yet, when we talk about crisis, companies leaving, foreign investors who don't want to invest in Italy, justice is always brought up. It's not criminal justice. Because criminal justice deals exclusively with punishing criminal offenses. What foreign entrepreneur should fear criminal justice if they haven't brought anything to Italy yet? If they haven't done anything yet, why should they fear it? The real problem is civil justice. Because lawsuits that are so convoluted, slow, and difficult to unravel, like a tangled skein, often make even the most patient entrepreneur give up. And yet civil justice is not addressed by those who focus exclusively on criminal justice. Maybe because the largest portion of parliamentarians declare their profession as lawyers, and therefore don't want to lose or make their colleagues lose job opportunities. Because the longer the lawsuits last, the more work there is to do. It seems obvious to me. And why intervene in criminal matters? Maybe because, by trying to dismantle the constitutional framework created by the Founding Fathers, they're trying to direct criminal prosecution, which in our country is mandatory when there is news of a crime. Trying to give priority to certain issues at the expense of others. Maybe that's it. As Giulio Andreotti used to say, thinking badly is a sin, but often you're right. I'll leave you with these thoughts. Think about it. Think carefully. Why do we have to go vote? Because evidently Parliament hasn't been able to find common ground. That's already a problem. But then let's go vote and show the members of Parliament that in the end, they're paid by us with our taxes. If we're asked to get involved in public matters, in decisions, in the need to participate in the political decision-making of this country, we citizens can really have our say, and we can also make it clear what we really think and what is truly useful for this country. Let's go vote. Then everyone will reflect, and in the voting booth will mark the box they think is right. Let's go. And let's show that Italians, ordinary citizens, are not just fools to be tricked by some rally in the square or on television. They are thinking beings. And also, quoting Aristotle, a political animal, and as such can take part in politics, feeling the need, the desire, the will to do so, to the point of making parliamentarians and members of the executive understand that not everything is fine, that they don't always really work for the good of the country, and that maybe the country's priorities are different. Go vote, I will do it. And maybe we'll talk again after the outcome of this 5th constitutional referendum. Have a good day, everyone.